Imagine you move into a house with a cozy fireplace, perfect for cold nights. But what if the chimney wasn't empty? What if there was something old and waiting, in the very walls of your home? Alice had always dreamed of living in an old house. Something with character. Something that told a story with every creak of the floorboards and every crack in the walls. She had spent years envisioning what it would be like to live in a house steeped in history, a place that felt alive with the weight of time. The search for the right house had taken months, but when she found it, it felt as though fate had led her there. The house was everything she had ever wanted. It was a sprawling Victorian manor nestled on the outskirts of a small, quiet town, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown vines that seemed to protect it from the world outside. The house was large, far too large for a single person, but Alice was undeterred. The moment she set foot inside, she knew it was meant for her. The air inside was thick with dust and age, but it was rich with the promise of something more. Every room had its own unique charm, its own distinct character. The hardwood floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets long forgotten. But there was one thing that stood out more than anything else: the chimney. Chimney 7, as she would come to call it, was the largest of the 7 chimneys in the house. It towered over the living room, a massive structure of dark, soot-covered bricks that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. The fireplace was grand, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, and the hearth was deep, as if it had been carved from the very stone of the earth. The bricks themselves were strange, darker than any she had seen before, as if they had absorbed the very essence of the fire that had once burned within them. Alice found herself drawn to the chimney, its dark presence almost magnetic. She would often find herself staring into the fire, watching the flames dance, her thoughts lost in the crackling sounds of the logs. But there was something else in the air. It was subtle at first, a mere flicker of movement at the corner of her eye, a brief shadow passing over the walls. She dismissed it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination, a trick of the flickering firelight. But the feeling persisted. Every night, when the house was still and the fire burned low, Alice could hear a faint scratching noise coming from the chimney. At first, it was quiet, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the days went by, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer just a soft scratching. It was something deliberate, something urgent. At first, Alice tried to convince herself that it was nothing. Perhaps it was a bird or a small animal that had found its way into the chimney, seeking warmth for the night. She called a professional chimney sweep to inspect it, but when the man arrived, he assured her that everything was fine. "It's an old house," he said with a chuckle. "Old houses settle, and sometimes animals make their way in. There's nothing to worry about." Despite his reassurances, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if something, or someone, was trapped inside the chimney. She found herself lying awake at night, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds echoing through the walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear it, the slow, rhythmic scratching from deep within the chimney. The nights became more difficult to bear. The house felt colder somehow, as if it had turned against her. Even though the fireplace was burning brightly, the air in the room felt thick and oppressive. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, its walls closing in. It was as though the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge it. And every time she tried to ignore it, the scratching would grow louder, as if the house was taunting her. One night, unable to sleep, Alice found herself standing in front of the fireplace, staring into the darkness of Chimney 7. The scratching was louder now, more frantic, as if whatever was inside the chimney was desperate to get out. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. It was then that she saw it. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable, moving within the darkness of the chimney. It wasn't the flicker of a shadow cast by the firelight, nor was it the shadow of the bricks themselves. No, this shadow was something else, something darker. It was long, thin, and seemed to shift and sway in unnatural ways, as if it had a life of its own. Alice froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't explain it, but she knew, deep down, that whatever was in Chimney 7 was not of this world. It wasn't an animal, nor was it a figment of her imagination. It was something older, something far more dangerous. The next day, Alice decided to investigate. She climbed up onto the roof, determined to see what was inside the chimney for herself. The wind was biting, and the sky was overcast, but Alice pressed on. She had to know what was causing the scratching, what was lurking in the darkness of Chimney 7. When she peered down into the chimney, she could see nothing. The darkness was impenetrable, deeper than any chimney she had ever encountered. She shone a flashlight down the opening, but the beam barely penetrated the blackness. She could feel the coldness emanating from within, as though the chimney had been hollowed out by centuries of decay. But as she watched, she thought she saw something move. It was quick, a flash of movement in the darkness, and then it was gone. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She had seen it, or at least she thought she had. It was as though something had shifted within the chimney, something large and heavy, and it had been watching her from the depths. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. Could it have been a bird? A bat? Something that had found its way into the chimney and was now stuck? But the movement had been too deliberate, too purposeful. No animal moved like that. She climbed back down from the roof, her head spinning. Something was wrong with the house, and it was clear that Chimney 7 was at the center of it. The scratching, the shadows, the sense of being watched, it all pointed to one thing. There was something in that chimney, something that had been trapped there for far too long. That night, Alice sat in front of the fireplace, her eyes fixed on Chimney 7. The scratching had grown louder, more frantic. She could hear it, feel it, deep within her bones. It was as though whatever was inside the chimney was trying to break free. And then, just as she thought she could take it no longer, she heard something else. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. The voice seemed to come from the chimney, from the darkness itself. It wasn't a human voice, nor was it anything familiar. It was low, guttural, and seemed to reverberate through the walls of the house. "Let me out," the voice whispered. Alice's blood ran cold. She could hear it now, the voice growing louder, more insistent. It was calling to her, beckoning her to open the chimney and release whatever had been trapped inside for so long. Alice jumped to her feet, her mind racing. She had to know what was in there. She had to know what was trying to get out. But as she approached the fireplace, she felt a sudden chill run through her body, a coldness that seemed to seep into her very soul. She stood there for a long moment, her heart hammering in her chest, unsure of what to do. And then, the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Let me out." Alice backed away slowly, the fear creeping up her spine. She couldn't explain it, but she knew, deep down, that the thing in Chimney 7 was not something she could ever hope to understand. If you're starting to feel the suspense build, don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone who loves a chilling mystery. Stay tuned as the terror continues. The following morning, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that the house had changed. It felt different, heavier somehow. The air was thick with a presence, as though the house itself was watching her, listening to her every movement. She went about her day in a fog, unable to focus on anything other than the disturbing events of the previous night. The whisper from the chimney lingered in her mind, echoing like a dark song. "Let me out." It had been so clear, so chilling. As she made her way downstairs for breakfast, she noticed something strange. The floorboards creaked under her feet, as they always did, but today the creaking was different. It was more pronounced, more urgent, as if the house was alive, groaning under the weight of its own age. She paused, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread creep up her spine. The house felt restless, as though it had been disturbed by something it couldn't contain any longer. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but the truth was inescapable. Whatever had been in that chimney, whatever had been calling to her, was now awake, and it wasn't going to let her forget. The scratching, too, had intensified overnight. The sounds from the chimney had grown louder, more frantic. It was no longer just a faint noise in the distance. It was right there, just on the other side of the wall, clawing, scraping, desperate. Alice could feel it deep in her chest, reverberating through her body like a physical presence. Every time she tried to ignore it, it only grew worse. The scratching became a constant companion, following her from room to room, echoing through the walls of the house. It was as though the house itself had become a conduit for whatever was trapped inside. Despite her fear, Alice knew she couldn't avoid it forever. She had to face it. She had to find out what was in the chimney, what had been calling to her in the dead of night. The more she tried to block it out, the more it consumed her thoughts, taking up every waking moment. She knew deep down that she couldn't live in the house, couldn't live with the scratching and the whispers, unless she confronted whatever lay in the darkness. It was late afternoon when Alice finally decided to act. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the air feel heavy, as though something is waiting, just out of sight. She stood in the living room for a long time, staring at the fireplace, at Chimney 7. The flames in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the room. The house felt colder now, as if the very walls had become frozen in time. Taking a deep breath, Alice walked toward the fireplace. She could hear the scratching again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from deep within the chimney, almost as if something were climbing its way up, clawing its way free. The noise sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to turn away. She was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. As she knelt before the hearth, her hand trembling, she glanced at the chimney. The darkness inside seemed to stretch on forever, an inky void that swallowed up the light of the fire. She knew she had to act fast, before whatever was inside the chimney made its move. With a shaking hand, she reached for the fireplace tools. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal handles as she lifted the poker from its stand. She could feel the weight of it in her hand, a comforting weight, but it did little to ease the unease gnawing at her stomach. The whispering voice from the previous night played in her mind again. "Let me out." Alice hesitated for a moment, then plunged the poker into the fireplace, using it to stir the embers. As she did, she heard a sudden, sharp sound, like the snapping of a twig. It came from the chimney, and it was followed by a low, guttural growl. Alice froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the soft scratching of an animal, nor the typical sounds of a house settling. It was something alive, something intelligent, something malevolent. Her heart pounded in her chest as the growling grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from deep within the chimney, vibrating through the walls of the room. She could feel it in her bones, a deep primal fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever was in the chimney to break free. Taking another deep breath, Alice stood up and moved toward the fireplace. She could see the faintest glimmer of something in the darkened depths of the chimney. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. Something was moving inside. She reached into the darkness, her fingers brushing against the cool brick. The moment her hand touched the surface, she felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her, as though the very house had come alive beneath her touch. Her pulse quickened as the growling intensified. The shadows within the chimney seemed to shift, growing larger, more menacing. She could hear the sounds now, the scraping of nails against stone, the rustling of something moving just out of reach. She couldn't see it, but she knew it was there, just beyond her reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. In that moment, Alice made a decision. She had to go up the chimney herself. She had to see what was inside, even if it meant confronting whatever nightmare lay hidden there. She knew that this could be the end of her, but she also knew that she couldn't live in this house, couldn't survive the growing terror that seemed to be seeping into her very soul unless she uncovered the truth. Climbing onto the roof was a challenge. The house was old, the roof steep and treacherous. The wind howled in her ears, and the sky above was heavy with dark clouds, but Alice pressed on. She had no choice. As she made her way toward Chimney 7, her heart raced. She was closer now. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the air growing colder with each step. The very atmosphere seemed to hum with energy, as though the house was alive, waiting for her to make a move. When she reached the chimney, she peered down into the darkness below. The air was thick, stagnant, and Alice felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She knew, deep down, that she was about to uncover something terrible, something that might change her life forever. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. With trembling hands, she dropped a rope down into the chimney, using it to lower herself into the darkness. The descent felt endless, the walls of the chimney closing in around her as she moved deeper into the void. The growling was louder now, echoing through the stone like a beast that was ready to pounce. As she reached the bottom of the chimney, Alice's flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. She shone the beam of light around, but saw nothing, only the dark, empty space that stretched out before her. The growling had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you and makes you feel as though the world has stopped spinning. But then she saw it, a movement in the corner of her eye, something shifting in the shadows. Alice's breath caught in her throat. There, in the farthest corner of the chimney, something was standing. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, but its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, stared back at her. The creature was there, waiting, watching, its presence suffocating. Alice took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't back away now. The creature took a step toward her, its movements fluid, almost graceful, as if it were part of the very darkness itself. "Let me out," it whispered again, its voice a raspy, chilling sound that reverberated through her bones. If you're feeling the tension rise, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. What do you think Alice is about to face? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The creature was closer now, its glowing eyes fixed on Alice, watching her every move. The air around her had become thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and her heartbeat echoed in her ears, faster and faster with every passing second. She could hear the faint rustling of its movements in the darkness, but she could not tear her eyes away from its unblinking stare. It wasn't just watching her, it was studying her, as though it were assessing whether she was worth its time. Alice's body was frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite process. She had always been a rational person, grounded in logic, but in this moment, that logic seemed to slip away from her like sand through her fingers. Nothing made sense. How had it come to this? How had a simple house, an innocent fireplace, turned into a nightmare? The house had been her dream, the place she had longed for her entire life. Yet now, it was the source of her greatest terror, a place where even the very walls seemed to want her gone. The creature moved again, a subtle shift, and Alice felt the air grow colder, heavier. It was as though the darkness was pressing in on her, swallowing up the light from her flashlight, turning the space around her into an endless void. It was in the shadows, a part of them, and yet it wasn't. She could feel it, a physical presence, something that wasn't bound by the same laws of nature as the world outside. It was beyond her understanding, beyond anything she had ever imagined. The creature took a step forward, its long, spindly limbs creaking with the sound of old, brittle bones. It moved so slowly, so deliberately, that it was almost as if it was savoring her fear. Alice's pulse quickened as she stepped back, but her body felt heavy, weighed down by the fear that was creeping into her limbs, slowing her movements. She couldn't move fast enough. She couldn't get away. The creature's whisper reached her ears, low and raspy, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. "Let me out," it repeated, each word sending a chill through her veins, an icy grip wrapping around her heart. Alice swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had to think. She had to do something. But what? The creature was trapped within the chimney, and yet somehow it felt like the house itself was holding it there, as if the walls, the bricks, were part of some ancient, twisted prison. What kind of force could bind something like this? Something so unnatural, so wrong. She had to know more. She had to understand what it wanted and why it was here. But even as she thought these things, she knew deep down that the creature could hear her. It was aware of her every thought, her every fear. It could feel the tremble in her hands, the panic rising in her chest. It was toying with her, playing a game that Alice couldn't understand. She had to get away. She had to escape before it was too late. With a sudden burst of willpower, Alice turned and bolted back toward the chimney, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it nearly drowned out the sound of the creature's footsteps behind her. But the moment she moved, the growling started again, louder this time, deeper, as if the very walls of the house were vibrating with the creature's rage. It was no longer just a voice. It was the sound of something primal, something that wanted to break free. Alice didn't look back. She couldn't. Every instinct in her told her to run, to escape the house, to leave the creature behind and never look back. But as she reached the chimney's opening, she felt a hand, cold and clammy, wrap around her ankle, pulling her back. She screamed, the sound echoing in the emptiness of the chimney. Her body was dragged backward, her hands scraping against the cold stone walls as she fought to free herself. But the grip was relentless, inhuman, and as she struggled, she could feel the darkness creeping closer, its cold tendrils wrapping around her mind, clouding her thoughts. She was losing control, losing herself to the fear, and she knew that if she didn't fight harder, she would never escape. In a blind panic, Alice reached down into her pocket and pulled out the key, the rusted ancient key she had found in the attic. She didn't know why, but in that moment, it seemed like the only option. She jammed it into the lock at the base of the chimney, not knowing what she was doing, not understanding why she had to do it. But the moment the key turned, a terrible sound filled the air. A low, grinding noise, like stone scraping against stone, and the walls of the chimney began to shift. The grip on her ankle loosened, and Alice pulled herself free, gasping for air. The creature's growl turned into a screech, a sound so piercing that it felt as though her very bones were vibrating with it. The walls of the house trembled, and for a moment, Alice thought the entire building was going to collapse. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The darkness in the chimney receded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Alice stood there, panting, her mind reeling. She could hear the sound of her own breath, harsh and ragged in the quiet, but nothing else. The creature was gone. The house was still. Alice stumbled backward, her heart still racing in her chest. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't understand why the key had worked or why the creature had stopped. But one thing was clear. The house had been hiding something ancient, something dangerous. And now it was free. She turned to leave, but as she made her way toward the door, she heard it again, the whisper, "Let me out." Alice froze. The voice wasn't coming from the chimney this time. It was coming from inside her head. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the house itself was twisting, warping, becoming something else. Her vision blurred, and the walls of the house seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though they were breathing, alive with the presence of whatever had been trapped here for so long. Alice turned, her legs giving way beneath her, and collapsed to the floor. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the house, it wasn't going to let her go. The floorboards groaned beneath her, and Alice looked up to see the shadows beginning to move. They weren't just cast by the furniture, they were moving, shifting, taking form. Faces, twisted and contorted in agony, appeared in the dark corners of the room, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out. The walls seemed to close in around her, the house itself pushing in, suffocating her with its presence. "Let me out," the voice whispered again, but this time, it wasn't just the creature's voice. It was the voice of the house that had been feeding on fear for generations, and now it had found its next victim. Alice scrambled to her feet, her head spinning, but the shadows were everywhere now. The door was just out of reach, but no matter how hard she tried to move, the walls seemed to press in on her, blocking her path. The house was alive, and it was hungry. What do you think is happening to Alice? Is it the house itself, or something far worse that's controlling it? Make sure to like this video and share it with anyone who enjoys a chilling psychological horror story. Stay tuned for more terrifying tales.